And happy Tuesday, NCAA basketball fans. This is your weekly Trogcast, two really old guys talking NCAA basketball. Old guy number one here, Jeff Zink, joined by my good friend, old guy number two, Jim Reaker. Jim, what's shaking on your side of the fence?
Oh, not much, Jeff. We're in February now and got that super game out of the way, Super Bowl, and now we focus, as the rest of the country kind of focuses now, on college basketball. This is when those conference races get exciting, and it seems like every day there's a game that will have a bearing on the outcome of those conferences.
Well, that's exactly the focus of what we're talking about today. We'll talk about a little bit some of the games we thought might affect those conferences last week, and then later in the show we will get to those who things that are coming up as they get closer and closer to the end. And in between, we'll talk a little bit about going back and looking at some of these first-year coaches we talked about earlier in the year and how they are doing with their programs as it works. But let's look back a little bit next week. I mean, we had a list of games. It wasn't a very busy week in terms of top 25 teams looking out for each other, but we'd look at maybe there would be a few upsets, but it looks like the big conference to look at last week was the Big 12. Texas Tech just barely escaped Texas, and but then the Longhorns turn around and beat Oklahoma. Tech then holds on to and pulls away from TCU. Kansas State drops to West Virginia very handily, so West Virginia seems to be back. And then, of course, their game last night against Oklahoma and the sick Trae Young. But, then Oklahoma State turns around and drops Kansas. So all of a sudden, we thought Kansas might be pulling away. The Big 12 is wide open again.
Yeah, and I think that's a story across college basketball. Or what I saw is I kind of looked through the standings this morning. Is it's if you want to clarify one word, I think is separation. Almost in every conference, you have one, two, or sometimes three teams that have kind of separated themselves at the top a little bit. And the Big 12, yeah, we've talked about it all season. It's a grinder, kind of like the Big East, where everybody plays everybody. So it's kind of your champion. When you get a champion at the end, they're a true champion because they've had to play everybody home and away. And, yeah, Texas Tech has tied Kansas. And, again, we talked about earlier, this might be the year that Kansas doesn't win or even share first place with somebody else in the top of the Big 12. And but then about a week ago, we thought Kansas had maybe found themselves, but then they ended up losing, and Texas Tech is back in a tie with them. And a game I watched pretty much from start to finish last night is about the only really big, interesting game I thought on. The West Virginia Mountaineers did go to Oklahoma to defeat Oklahoma. And, yeah, sick Trae Young. Although Trae Young is getting a lot of attention in two cases. He's getting a lot of media attention, which may be a little distracting for him, but he's also now getting a lot of attention from defenses. They seem to be keying on him and trying to not let the rest of the Oklahoma team hurt them. Last night he did have 32 points, but he only had one assist. This comes from a guy who's averaging almost 10 assists a game. So I think that's going to be Oklahoma's problem going forward, that teams are going to let him get his due, but they're not going to let the rest of the team beat him. And I think, he was sick, but he didn't make any excuse for that. And he did make some plays on his own, but he didn't have many assists, and that was kind of the key to that game. It was an ugly game, Jeff. The West Virginia Mountaineers had 50 points at halftime and only ended up scoring a little over 70, so a little over 20-some points. In fact, here's a key stat. To start the second half, both teams combined were 1 from 19 from the field for the first 5 minutes. It was I'm not sure if it was great defense or poor offense or probably a little bit of both.
Yeah, well, that's true, and that's as we've said before with Bobby Huggins, if that scatter pressure defense is working, they get their points off turnovers and things like that. And if it's not working, which it hasn't been for them all that much because they had lost 5 of their previous 6, going into last week. You got to make that happen. So let's sort of combine, what we talked about last week and then move right into this week. In the Big 12, a couple big games this week. TCU has to go to Kansas, and Kansas has already lost 3 games at Fog Allen. That's amazing on the season. And Oklahoma is going to Texas Tech, and that's their first test. Really, Texas Tech's, if they're going to hold on to it, their big test is further down the line, where their last 3 regular season games are against Kansas, West Virginia, and TCU. So big week last week, not as big of a week this week in the Big 12, but they're so tightly packed, like you say. Texas Tech and Kansas at top at 7-3, West Virginia just a half game behind at 7-4, and then Oklahoma sitting there at 6-5. So it could go either way. The near future in the Big 12 from your perspective.
Well, you bring up a good point that, as of last week, again, we thought that Kansas, it looks like they had maybe separated themselves out. But and then if you look at Kansas, you always think, well, Fog Allen, they're not going to lose. But, yeah, you bring up a good point. They've lost 3 times there already, and kind of the mystique and magic and that being a great home court advantage has gone away this year. So when we readjusted about 3 or 4 weeks, I picked West Virginia to win it. I don't know. That's a tough league. Kansas, I think they're so well coached. Bill Self does such a great job. I could still see him pulling out the rabbit out of the hat and at least getting a share of the Big 12 for the 14th straight season. But those 3 games for Texas Tech, they got to feel good about it. They can actually earn it. Everything's in front of them. They're tied for first right now, and if they can come up with some big wins near the end of the regular season, they might be the champion. But kind of like in that league, anybody can beat anybody on any given night. So again, I'll stick with West Virginia.
You have to stick with West Virginia. You cannot change again. We've made that criteria. You can't keep swapping back and forth like I'm going to stick. Otherwise, you change. But that's the beauty of the college season. Things do change, and that's definitely a conference that's going to go down to the final weekend, and in the regular season. Then, of course, they'll beat up on each other in the tournament. And for most of these, it is a pride thing to win the regular season, but most of the NCAA bids are tied to the tournament. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. Let's shift gears quickly here to another of your conferences that didn't have much going on last week, but has a really big week coming up, and that's the Big Ten. Right now, you got Purdue at the top at 12-0, Ohio State at 11-1, Michigan State at 10-2, and this is a big week for Purdue because they host OSU earlier this week, and then over the weekend they have to go up to East Lansing. If Purdue can hold court and if they win both of those, I'd pretty much have to say that the Big Ten is theirs. But this is the chance for the Buckeyes and the Spartans to make some noise and knock Purdue off their undefeated perch here in the Big Ten.
Yeah, well, you cover it, a great synopsis of the overall race there. Purdue, Ohio State, Michigan State. Again, I picked Purdue. Early on I was watching that team. They got a lot of weapons. They got the 2 big 7+ foot guys that play underneath. They got Carson Edwards, who's a great point guard. Vincent Edwards, who's a great shooting guard. I think Purdue is going to win that. But yeah, this week will definitely tell. If they would happen to lose to Ohio State or Michigan State, it'll tighten that race up a little bit. I think they need to win one of those to really kind of set themselves in a good position. But, yeah, and some people believe, and it's hard to argue, that maybe Purdue's the best team in the country. Of course, Michigan State, a lot of talent, a lot of things going on. Last week we talked about the scandal there that I think kind of overshadows the program. They got some young guys that seem to be inconsistent at times. In fact, both Michigan State and Purdue went to Indiana in the last week, and both of them had a tough time at Assembly Hall, as Archie Miller does a good job. We're going to talk about coaches, first-year coaches. We'll talk about him a little bit. But yeah, by But this time next week, that one should have almost sorted itself out a little bit. And for the fans, one key thing, if you remember, we talked about this earlier, their league tournament's a week earlier than the other power conferences, reason being they wanted to use Madison Square Garden, and the Big East already had dibs on Madison Square Garden for their league tournament, so they're going to be playing their league tournament a little bit early, and that'll be interesting to see how that plays out going into March. They're going to get probably about a week off in between the end of that and the beginning of the NCAA tournament. But again, I picked Purdue, and I think that they're going to come out on top in the Big Ten.
Well, you make a good point. This week, if they lose to Ohio State, they'll be tied atop the Big Ten standings, and if they would happen to beat Ohio State and lose to Michigan State, they'd still be a game ahead of both of them, and that's going to make a difference. But they don't have to play either of those from here on out, and their schedule would lighten up, so somebody's going to have to step up and do it. So big week for the Boilermakers, that's for sure. Just very quickly, we also mentioned the possibility of Houston coming into Cincinnati and the AAC. Cincinnati pretty much has a lock on that right now, and they did take care of Houston rather handily by 10. Cincinnati 3 games up there, but they do still have 2 games. They have a home and home with Wichita State, who's 3 games back, and they have to do their Texas swing away to SMU and Houston back-to-back, and it's all but Cincinnati in charge there, and we'll just have to follow that up. And that's what you talk about separation, Jim. That's what's kind of happening at this point as we get down to the end. There has been some separation. So a conference that not much was happening last week is one of mine, but got some big doings this week. We joked at the end about St. John's, who hadn't. We talked this more on our Razorcast because the Johnnies had just played Xavier. About them having to go in and play Duke, and Duke coming into Madison Square Garden, and you slipped in the joke about, but St. John's could beat Duke, and I laughed and said, oh, no, there's no way. But they did just that, which tells you how dangerous the Big East is and what Chris Mullin's doing there. And so the Blue Devils fall again to a team that's their first win in 2018. But this coming week is a big one for Virginia. And that's the team atop of the ACC at 11-0. They have a 3-game lead, but they have to travel to Florida State, who just dropped out of the top 25, and that was one of the games we talked about last week. Them and a couple other squads. But then they have to host the in-state rival Virginia Tech, and then they have to go back to Florida and play number 25 Miami. So those are the big games. If they can get through this, again, if they would happen to win all 3 of those, they'll have a 3-game lead with 4 to play, and they don't have to play any of the teams that are right behind them right now, which are Clemson and Duke. Those are the ones with the best chance of catching them. So a big game for Tony Bennett and the boys, and you talked a lot about Virginia and what they were doing last week and how they have a team approach. But this is going to be a test for them over the next 7-8 days.
Yeah, and a couple points there. Number one, I wasn't kidding when I said St. John's could beat Duke, because I said this is a dangerous team and they're going to beat somebody. And I said, and you were the one that said, yeah, right, that's not happening, and laughed it off. So I think that was a combination of a team that's better than their 0-10 record in the Big East. Against a highly touted team of individuals who are, number one, very young. Number two, they are just that. Sometimes they don't play together as a team. And here's a point that's, this is supposed to be rivalry week, I guess, on ESPN. Mm-hmm. And, of course, one of the big centerpiece games almost always in college basketball is Duke and North Carolina. And I
was going to bring that up after you talked about Virginia, but we'll go to that. Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about a Duke who has 3 losses and a North Carolina who, if they would lose another game, they would just be 500. I like Virginia too. I think they're going to do something in the tournament. They they play that constant, that defense and that ball control, and don't turn the ball over. And in a topsy-turvy NCAA year where anybody can beat anybody and anybody can get upset, Virginia is a team I think that has a chance to win every time they go out, and has kind of had obviously guarded themselves against the upset bug, being 11-0 in the conference and 22-1 overall, and number 2 in the country, just behind that tough Villanova team.
Well, that's it. And I was going to bring up it is the rivalry week. That's why Vatek's going to Virginia and Duke and Carolina. You just never know what's going to go on there. There's not really a whole lot to say until it's over with, because those two teams they could be at this point 23-0 or 0-23, and that's just a battle down there in the Tobacco Road between those. But Virginia has a chance now to really create separation, as Purdue does. So big week for them. Like I say, they get through this week, and they're sitting on top of the ACC at 14-0. There's nobody that can catch them, and that could be a benefit or a curse, because they might cruise down the end and lose a couple and ease their way into the tournament time, and you don't want them to relax. Another one of your groups is the Big East, and not a whole lot was going on there. We thought the potential upset, Seton Hall, they can play tough, but last weekend Villanova handled them pretty easily. But this is actually a big week, not for Villanova. That's sort of coming next week for them, but it's kind of a big week for the Musketeers, because they have to go to Butler and to Creighton. And Butler, it's also a big week for them as they try to make a dent in the Big East standings. They're sitting at 7-4 right now because they have Xavier and Villanova on their schedule. If they would happen to pull off the double upset there, they're right back in the mix for the Big East. But as you often say in the Big East, anything can happen. But like I said, next week's the big one for Nova. They have to host Butler this week, and then they've got Providence, got to travel to Providence and to Xavier, and that's if they don't fall asleep against that St. John's team, which they have to play before all this happens, which is sitting at 0-11 in the Big East.
Yeah, a couple points you make there. Xavier, again, 2 tough road games, their last real road trip, so to speak. After this, they don't play any back-to-back road games, which has to be an advantage for them in February, when going on the road can be very, very tough. And, basically if Xavier can defeat Butler and Creighton, again, both of them are away, not going to be easy. 2 very, very tough venues to play in Hinkle Fieldhouse and the Century Link Center in Omaha. But if Xavier could somehow pull both those out, that really separates that league out, and it'll be probably down to the wire between Villanova and Xavier, who play in about 2 weeks. I think February the 17th is when the Wildcats come to the Cintas Center. But it'd be interesting to see how the Johnnies come out of that versus Villanova. They do have to go to Philadelphia to play that game. I think that's tomorrow night. And here's something maybe more important. I think Chris Mullins is on the hot seat. Question is, does that win over Duke, does that save his job? I would say if he could somehow upset Villanova, that would really give him another feather in his cap. But I question, I'm sure some basketball gurus are questioning some of the coaching that has gone on there. In fact, right at the end of the Xavier game, they had a chance. They were down a couple points, and they came down, and Shamori Pons, who ended up scoring, I think, 33 in that game, didn't touch the ball. And now that definitely got changed, because the same situation kind of came again against Duke. It came right down to the end, and at least somebody learned something, because in that game, Shamori Pons touched the ball every time at the end of the game, made some great plays to help pull off that upset. But as I think Chris Mullins has some work to do. If they cannot win a game in the Big East, I think he's really in trouble. But again, maybe he's starting to get them to turn the corner. They got some very, very talented guys. They just they don't seem to play together all the time. Big East is going to, we'll have a real clear picture, I think. But, yeah, you're right. If Creighton and Butler could beat Xavier, they're going to at least jump themselves back into challenging Xavier for that second spot at the year end.
Yeah, and that'll put them just a little behind if Nova stumbles a little bit later. And then, of course, like you say, that next week we might be talking about another matchup between two top 5 teams right now, Xavier at number 5, Villanova at number 1, like we've been talking about Purdue and Michigan State this week. The couple other conferences last week, not a whole lot happened. Pac-12, the big thing was Washington came in and upset Arizona, so the misery out there continues, and it's a big week for Arizona coming up in the next 9 days or so. They've already had their California swing, but now they have to host UCLA and USC. And right now, I mean, what's tough about that is Arizona, as we've talked about before, isn't really gelling. And UCLA, if they win, is going to put them back in the mix. And USC is only a game behind Arizona. So if Arizona can't hold court there before they have that big rivalry game against the Sun Devils, who pretty much fallen off the cliff here lately with 6 losses in the Pac-12 after their very hot start, that's going to throw open the Pac-12. It is pretty much open anyway. Arizona only has a 1-game lead over the Trojans. But this is a big week for Sean Miller and the Wildcats out there in the desert.
Yeah, the Pac-12 is really, I mean, not getting much exposure. Arizona has kind of been the dominant team. Yeah, but and the thing that just shocks you is, I mean, just think back a little over a month ago, we were talking about the Arizona State Sun Devils, who were, I believe, at the time ranked 3rd in the country, were undefeated going into league play, and everybody was talking about them, the job Bobby Hurley, and now they don't even have a 500 record in what many would probably consider the weakest of the Power 5 or 6 conferences that we talk about. So kind of, and some of it, of course, is the timing, the fact that games get played later out there. But just, again, if you ask me any day, who's leading the Pac-12, I'd be, of course, again, Arizona with Sean Miller has been kind of a steadfast team at the top. And, again, they're still at the top, but they've had their issues sometimes too, even though they have some very talented players.
And if I continuing on that question, if I ask you who is leading the SEC right now, who would you say without looking at the standings?
I'd say Auburn, but I just knew that because they have been getting a lot of media attention for the job that Bruce Pearl has done there. But you're right, that the SEC is not the SEC that we've seen, and number one, Kentucky is not dominating like they usually do, and some of the other teams that have been at the top haven't come through this year.
Yeah, last week one of the games we mentioned to look at as a possible upset was Alabama going to Florida, and Florida couldn't hold home court advantage. I mean, both teams a little schizophrenic, and you got to wonder what Avery Johnson's doing there. But Alabama thumped them, 68-50, and they're sort of in the mix. But Auburn isn't really the team to watch, but the game to watch this week is Tennessee has to go to Rupp. If Kentucky loses that, their chances of winning the SEC are over. They'd be at 6-5, and Tennessee needs that game to stay in contact with Auburn. They're 2 games back right now, so big game there, which probably isn't going to get a lot of talk, even though it's 2 top 25 teams, and you sending out kudos again. You got to send out a kudo to Rick Barnes, who kind of got shuffled out the door at Texas, thinking he was kind of burnt out and not putting his energy into it, and he has brought the Volunteers just crashing into the new year, and they're looking good. And if Tennessee can win that one, I mean, they don't have a whole lot of challenges going down the stretch, but unfortunately they don't have any games against Auburn, who they've already beaten, because they just have the 1 game this year in order to catch them.
I could find out. Do Kentucky and Auburn play each other? I'm sure they do because I don't think they've played yet, right? I could pull that up real quick with Valentine's Day. Kentucky goes to Auburn. That'll be, I'm sure, a big hyped game and could have a big bearing on that. But, yeah, you got to give kudos to Bruce Pearl, what he's done at Auburn, especially, remember, they were one of the 4 schools that were mentioned in the FBI investigation, and it seems to have not affected them as they're having one of their best seasons ever. In fact, I believe, I'll say this, I'm not sure it's completely true, but they've jumped into the top 10 nationally in the rankings.
Auburn, yes, they're number 8, and those are names you would think. Auburn's at number 8, and Texas Tech, who we talked about, is in the top 10 as well at number 7. School's not necessarily known for their basketball. You know, as you touted a couple weeks ago, the city of Cincinnati, very proud to have 2 teams in there, as well as the Northern Kentucky Norse playing well and the Horizon. So a lot of shifting sands here, but you're right. Bruce Pearl's done a great job. As long as you're not one of his players trying to check in behind him when he gets excited. I saw that viral video where he smacked one of his players in the face. But a big game for Rick Barnes in Tennessee this week, and we'll have to see. They've done a great job there, but sitting at 75. But that's another one of those conferences where it's unless Bruce Pearl can get past Kentucky and continue pulling away, that might be one that goes down to the last sort of week or so because they're not as strong as they used to be, and the Tigers not only have to face UK, but a Texas A&M team that we thought would be better. Frank Martin, who right now would be one of my candidates for Coach of the Year in the SEC, because they didn't expect me much, and he's beaten a couple of tough teams. Got to play that schizophrenic Alabama, a tough Florida team, and then finish again with South Carolina. So a lot of things could still happen there at Auburn and in the SEC. That's going to be similar to what we were talking about in the Big 12. A lot of things could bounce back and forth, and there isn't as much separation as there have been. Let me throw a couple things in here about some other conferences because they got some big games coming in. This week's big for the West Coast Conference. Gonzaga travels to St. Mary's, and they're sitting at number 12 and number 11. They've been that way since St. Mary's was out of the top 25 and upset Gonzaga a couple weeks ago. So Gonzaga will be seeking to revenge that loss. And, of course, this is going to determine the regular season championship in the West Coast Conference as it does. If St. Mary's wins it, they'll have a 2-game lead over Gonzaga with only about 5 to go, and there aren't many teams maybe get bit in the heels by a BYU or something like that. And if Gonzaga beats them, they'll probably end up going tied into their tournament. In the Mountain West, Nevada has to travel to Boise State not this week, but next week. And the Boise State's just a half game back of them in a conference where we talked about them a couple weeks ago, but they've been very quiet, so that's going to come down to the 2 of those. In the Atlantic 10, another idea of separation, Rhode Island has a 3-game lead, and it looks pretty safe, but lurking behind them at 7-3 now, actually it's a 3.5-game lead, is Davidson, and they have to play Davidson twice before the end of the season, and they also have to play St. Bonaventure once, who's in back of them. So it seems like Rhode Island and some of these, when we look at the mid-majors, the West Coast, the Mountain West, the Atlantic 10 teams we talked about a couple weeks ago, things are a little more solidified than they are in some of the Big 6 conferences.
And you mentioned, again, another conference that's very close to home here. Wright State and NKU are tied at the top, and they've kind of separated themselves in the Horizon League. And they have a big game coming up on February the 16th, and things are very, very much do or die when you're in that league, because that league, I can almost say with certainty that only the tournament champion is going to get into the NCAA, and it's probably going to come down to Wright State and NKU unless there's an upset. They're probably going to be the 1-2 teams. They actually play each other on February the 16th. That'll probably be a game that'll have a major impact on who wins the conference and gets the number one seed. But again, it's going to probably come down to that tournament final. And again, you never know. Somebody else could step in there, and then Wright State and NKU, again, talk about that here in Cincinnati, because Wright State's just about an hour to the north, and NKU borders Cincinnati on the south side. So kind of a conference that's going to be fun to watch. And again, going to come down to the wire, who gets into the NCAA tournament. And remember, NKU, first time they were eligible last year, and they were the ones, they kind of pulled a couple upsets because they, I think, were about the 4 or 5 seed last year and ended up winning that tournament. So that'll be a fun one to watch for us here in the tri-state area.
Well, that's like I said earlier, that's for pride, because the NCAA tournament bid comes off the tournament winner on most of these, and we'll talk about that as we get closer. So you want to be in the best position to get a seed, so you get a bye. You get to even just bench position that you prefer, or the color of the uniform, little things that make a difference. But you're right. In the Horizon League, it's unlikely that more than one team is going to go, and that's the difficulties we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, when all of these conferences are assured of at least one position. And we talked about the Southwest Athletic Conference, which, right now doesn't even have a team with a winning record overall. They're led by Arkansas Pine Bluff, which is 9-2, and all 9 of their wins are within the conference. But somebody from the SWAC is going to go to the NCAA, and who knows, they might be one of those upsetters in the early games. But all of it, that's what's fun as we get closer to the end here. By the time we come back, we'll only be about a week out of those tournaments starting. So lots of fun basketball still to go. But one of the things we wanted to talk about here was sort of going back and reflecting on some of those first-year coaches we talked about a lot. You mentioned like Chris Mullen being on the hot seat, and we've come back to that. I thought Bruce Pearl was one of the SEC coaches that would be on the hot seat due to his record in the NCAA investigation. Okay, get my elocution lessons in there. And he's done well, and a couple others. But going into the first year of a program is always tough, no matter what the program quality is. And we've got some coaches that have done some pretty good jobs throughout there. So any coaches in particular that you want to highlight that you think should be lauded for their first year?
Well, I have 3, and this may just be me talking geographically, because it's the 3 that I probably see the most and read the most about, because they're all at schools here in the Midwest where we're coming from. First of all, Chris Holtmann, the job he's done at Ohio State. Some people had picked Ohio State to finish dead last in that, but he came in late in the summer after Thad Matta left that position. So I think he's done an unbelievable job. They're contending for the championship. They're in the top 15 in the country, and definitely I'm almost certain to say they'll be an NCAA tournament. So he'd be my number 1. Of course, we saw him do the same thing when he came in at Butler as an assistant, kind of late because of can't remember the man's name who left in the summer, and they brought Holtmann in to replace him, and he did a great job of keeping Butler very, very relevant in the Big East. And then I got to talk about his successor, Butler, Laval Jordan, who was a Butler guy, and he actually led the Bulldogs to a big victory over Ohio State early in the season. And then, of course, you can't forget what they did at Hinkle Fieldhouse to lay the only loss on the Villanova Wildcats so far. So Laval Jordan, a Butler guy, and he continues, as they talk about, continues the Butler way of doing things, and they have been successful. And, of course, I'll be watching them tonight, cheering against them as the Musketeers are over in Indianapolis this evening for a big East game. And then I have to mention Archie Miller. I think he's done a great job at Indiana. Again, kind of the cupboard was bare. Just reading a little bit about his recruiting, he has two of Indiana high school's top recruits already signed, but here's a name I'm going to throw out for you. Going to be a big name next year is Romeo Langford. He is a high school New Albany product, and he's one of the top recruits in the country. And if Archie Miller can get him, I think he can bring Indiana back to the prominence they had before. Are you there? I hear some strange beep.
I'm here.
Okay.
Maybe some sort of strange beat.
I know what the strange beep is. There's a call coming in on my phone, and that's why I was beeping. So
that might have something to do with it. You're not radioactive, Jim.
Yeah, I'm not. Those three are my choices of coaches. And just mention again, Archie Miller. They gave Purdue and Michigan State both all they wanted on their home court. So I don't think he's too far away. I mean, you watch Indiana play; they're kind of offensively challenged also. But if he can get, he's already gotten two of those big high school stars out of Indiana, and that's what he said when he took that job, and that was the complaint I've heard for years over in the Hoosier State. Then Tom Crean was there that he wasn't getting some of those boyhood stars out of the right in his own backyard, and just to mention that supposedly one of the reasons that they didn't get Trayvon Blewett, because they didn't recruit him heavily. So those are my three choices. Again, very, very biased because they're all here in the Midwest, very close to home from our home.
Well, my choices bounce sort of all over. One, I got to go with a couple of pairs that are very interesting, and one is in your conference, and that would be Brad Underwood, who's done the job at Illinois that Archie Miller's done. Both of them sitting at 12 and 11, and not much going there. But you talk about a program that was bare. That was Illinois. But Brad Underwood, a lot of people wondered why he would leave Oklahoma State, but he's made it work. But that also set the opening for Mike Boynton to come into Oklahoma State, and he's had some nice upsets there, and he's got that program looking good, and what we just talked about was a very up and down Big 12. So there's where one replaces another, and another set of those is when you look at Quanzo Martin moving to Missouri, and they expected big things out of him, and they haven't had the year that they thought they would. But losing Michael Porter Jr., who they just might get back before the end of the year, Quanzo's done a great job there. And of course, a lot of people said, and I was one of them. Of course, he's from that area, but why would you leave California? And one of his assistants, Wyking Jones, has taken over that program. And even though record-wise, you wouldn't look at it as all that fantastic, 7-16. They have they've put it to some teams, and they run a little bit of pressure, and they go after the boards. So they're doing very well. They're one of the ones that I think you really have to send out a big kudo to is what Mike Hopkins is doing at Washington. First-time coach, a long time Jim Boeheim assistant. Took over for Lorenzo Romar, who's kind of run out of town after not having much success in getting to the postseason. And then, of course, he had Markelle Fultz last year and couldn't make anything happen. And a team where they thought that cupboard was bare, they're 16-6, and he's brought a zone defense in there that just shuts people down, kind of like Xavier's 1-3-1 does. And the other one we mentioned a couple weeks ago is Kevin Keats at North Carolina State. They've been giant killers. A lot of people wondered why they got rid of Coach Godfrey, but sometimes you just need a change. They're not at the top of the ACC, but he's got them in position with big wins over, Zona and Duke and Clemson and North Carolina to have that sort of schedule that might get them into the NCAAs in his first year. So lots of great jobs being done by first-year coaches.
You are correct there.
Okay. All right. We'll wrap that up then. we'll go on to our trivia tidbits then.
Well, a couple, I always try to have my question relate to something that we've talked about today, and we just wrapped up there with coaches. And, of course, early on in our segment, we talked about that close race in the Big 12 right now. So it led me to a question: what current Big 12 coach was two-time Player of the Year in 1973-74, and what was known then as the Big 8? So what Big 12 coach was Player of the Year back-to-back years in the Big 8?
Holy crap. 73, 74. And he's coaching in the Big 12 right now?
That is correct.
Okay. Think back. Wasn't Bill Self? He didn't go there. Snyder. You got Drew, but he didn't play in the Big 12 either. You got me with that one. I'm trying to go through the coaches in the Big 12, but I can't remember their playing careers as well as soon as they play. So who you got?
Lon Kruger, who now coaches the Oklahoma Sooners. He was at Kansas State. I don't remember him, and I didn't realize he was such a talented point guard at Kansas State. In fact, when he was there, they actually, his sophomore and junior year, won the Big 8, back-to-back championships. He was Sophomore of the Year in the Big 8 in 1972 and was Player of the Year in the Big 8, 1973 and 74. Actually went on and played in the NBA a little bit. And his coaching career, I guess I realized this, but I didn't realize this. He actually started at the University of Texas Pan American, and then he went back to his alma mater at Kansas State for a while. And then the first time I kind of remember him, he was at Florida with the Gators for a while. Then he went out and resurrected the program at UNLV before going to Oklahoma, of course. And just 2 years ago, of course, at Oklahoma, he made it all the way to the Final Four. So kind of makes a little bit of sense that why Trae Young, I think, does so well, because, again, his head coach was a very, very good player back in the day at that position. So
yeah,
just a little
very successful coach, which also took Florida to the Final Four, I think, as well. So they're got a lot of success. That was a good one. You stumped me with that one. Okay,
well, here's another thing. He was also a very good baseball and football player, and in fact was, I think, drafted in both sports. I know he was definitely drafted in baseball. He was a baseball pitcher and actually played baseball at Kansas State. And I thought I read that he actually had a football career too, and maybe was drafted or offered. So, you don't look at Lon Kruger as, I don't know, I just never in my mind picture him as this great athlete, but obviously he was.
Mm-hmm. Well, we see him patrolling the sidelines, which most of these guys have got sports backgrounds from way, way back. And, again, thank you for joining us today. We'll be back next week with more information on our weekly Trogcast, and join us on Thursdays for our Razorcast, which is about all things Muskie basketball, that being the Xavier variety of it. And we'll just finish with a couple little tidbits here. Anniversary 1971, Interstellar Sports. On this date, Alan Shepard hit a golf ball on the moon. I think the only time that he's been able to play through, don't have to worry about it. And in 1990, Brett Hull scored his 50th goal of the NHL season, making him and his father, Bobby, the only father-son duo to score 50 goals in a year. And happy birthday to George Herman, the Babe Ruth. Would have been 123 years old if he'd have made it, born on this date in 1895 in Baltimore, Maryland. And two sad farewells on this date. 1958 was the crash of an airplane outside Munich, Germany, that took the lives of 7 members of the Manchester United Football Club, which is still remembered deeply in that city and with their club. And in 1993, tennis champ Arthur Ashe passed away due to complications due to AIDS after a blood transfusion. And he, of course, people remember for his breaking a lot of color barriers in tennis, and one of the courts in the U.S. Open being named for him. So lots of things going on, lots of basketball. Like Jim said, now that the NFL is over, the focus from now until first weekend in April is going to be on NCAA basketball, and we look forward to talking to you every week about it. Any final thoughts before we sign off, Jim?
No, I guess we should call this Furious February, because Furious February will lead to March Madness. One other, that I was just thinking about the golf drive, Alan Shepard. Is that still going, or did it come down?
Yeah, it didn't go on like they tend to picture it. In fact, he barely got it. He said he chunked it a little bit, and he got in trouble with NASA for doing that because he had to sneak he actually just took the head of one of his clubs up and a ball, and then he had to attach it to one of the tools that they had. And with his spacesuit, it wasn't too easy to hit, but up in less gravity it traveled. But no, it didn't just go and go, because there is some gravity on the moon, so something was pulling it back. But Alan Shepard, quite the character, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts who overcame an ear issue to be able to come back and walk on the first man in space and one of the few to walk on the moon. So not still going, but that's a good point. All right.
All right.
We will see
the games, and we'll talk about them again next week.
Mm-hmm.